Cuba has been dealing with electricity shortages for a long time, and it all traces back to how its energy system developed. Before 1959, Cuba's main trade partner was the United States because of how close the two are, just 100 miles apart. But things changed when Fidel Castro came into power in 1959. He brought in communist ideas and moved Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, which upset the US. The US reacted by placing sanctions on Cuba and cutting off all trade. For a while, Cuba managed fine because the Soviet Union, led by Russia, stepped in to help. Russia provided Cuba with a lot of cheap oil in exchange for things like sugar. This allowed Cuba to build power plants that ran on oil, providing plenty of electricity. Since the oil was coming in cheaply, Cuba could produce as much electricity as it needed without worrying too much about the cost. However, when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, Cuba lost its main source of oil. This left the country struggling to find another supplier. And that is when Venezuela, a country with the largest oil reserves in the world, stepped in. Venezuela, also a socialist country, offered Cuba cheap oil to keep their power plants running. While this helped for a while, Cuba's electricity system is still fragile because it depends so much on imported oil. Any disruptions in the oil supply quickly lead to electrical shortages. This has left the country in a tough spot, dealing with frequent power cuts that affect everyday life for the people of Cuba. However, Cuba's electricity problem has worsened in recent years, especially as Venezuela faced its own economic crisis. About 6 or 7 years ago, Venezuela was hit with severe sanctions from the US and other Western countries after accusations of election rigging. As a result, Venezuela drastically cut back the amount of oil it was sending to Cuba. This left Cuba in a difficult position, forcing it to buy oil on the international market, which is costly. Running electricity plants on oil is one of the most expensive ways to generate power today. With Cuba no longer receiving discounted or free oil and not having the money to afford costly oil imports, the country has struggled to keep its electricity grid running smoothly. Power cuts have become a regular issue, causing major disruptions to daily life and the economy. One of the biggest impacts of these power cuts is on businesses. Companies in Cuba face outages that can last up to 12 to 14 hours a day. This makes it nearly impossible to maintain consistent production, especially when the blackouts occur during the work hours. For everyday Cubans, the situation is also very difficult. Long periods without electricity mean no lights and, during the scorching summer months, no air conditioning to provide relief from the heat. The lack of reliable power has made life very difficult for both businesses and citizens. Cuba's options to fix this problem are limited. If the country had enough funds, it could invest in alternative energy sources like hydroelectric power or renewable energy, which don't rely on oil. However, Cuba does not have the resources to build such infrastructure. Its strained international relations make it even harder to get outside help. The US continues to enforce sanctions. Russia is in no position to offer large-scale financial aid, and China, though an ally, has yet to commit to any major investment in Cuba's energy sector. With no easy way out, Cuba's economy continues to struggle. Without a stable electricity supply, it becomes almost impossible to grow the economy. This leaves Cuba trapped in a cycle of power shortages and economic challenges that seem difficult to overcome. Apart from facing severe power shortages, Cubans are now dealing with widespread water shortages, a crisis that presents a direct threat to survival. According to the Cuban government, over 60,000 people, which is more than 1 in 20, are struggling with unreliable water supplies. Havana is experiencing the worst of it, but many of the country's largest cities are also heavily affected, with more than 30,000 households without regular access to water. Officials blame the worsening situation on the country's deteriorating infrastructure and ongoing fuel shortages. These issues are part of a much larger economic crisis that has pushed Cuba to the brink of bankruptcy. The water crisis is just one symptom of the country's failing systems. In Havana, residents like Rachel Tramino are not surprised by the problem. She points out that the streets are full of leaking pipes with clean water spilling out into the open, but little to none reaches people's homes. The country's water infrastructure, which includes outdated pipes and pumps, is in desperate need of repair. However, replacement parts are hard to come by, and the government has been unable to secure enough fuel to transport energy water supplies where they're most needed. On top of that, the frequent power cuts are making the water shortage even worse. Water systems need electricity to pump and distribute water, and when the power goes out, it's impossible to get water to people's homes. One local resident who works with a church's group offering small amounts of water to those in need explained, "When they cut power off, we cannot deliver water. One thing depends on another, and that is the cycle we are stuck in." Even emergency water deliveries by truck have been limited due to the lack of fuel. The combination of power cuts, broken infrastructure, and scarce resources has created a crisis where access to water is becoming more and more difficult for everyday Cubans. With no clear solution in sight, the ongoing shortages of water and electricity are leaving residents in a difficult situation, struggling to meet their basic needs. Cuba's food crisis has also worsened significantly over the past years. The country's agricultural production has dropped, with beef and pork production being hit particularly hard. In the first half of 2024, Cuba only produced 15,200 tons of beef compared to over 172,000 tons in 2022. Pork production has suffered even more, dropping from 149,000 tons in 2018 to less than 3,800 tons in the first 6 months of 2024. This represents a drastic decline of around 90%. The root causes of this food shortage are complex, including severe fuel shortages, outdated infrastructure, and a lack of agricultural inputs like fertilizer and machinery. Cuba's reliance on petroleum-based agriculture has also worsened the problem, as fuel is essential for both food production and transportation. With Venezuela and Russia unable to provide the same level of support due to their own economic and political challenges, Cuba has struggled to import enough fuel to keep the agricultural sector running. Climate conditions, aging infrastructure, and a shrinking workforce have also made it harder for Cuba to maintain its food supply. The government has tried to implement new laws to improve food sovereignty and increase production, but the lack of resources has made progress slow. As a result, many Cubans face daily struggles to access basic food staples, and the situation is only expected to worsen unless external support or significant reforms are introduced. Cuba is currently experiencing a major population decline, resulting from a combination of emigration, low birth rates, and a high number of deaths. Between 2021 and 2023, Cuba's population fell from around 11.2 million to just over 10 million, marking a decline of more than 10%. The main factor contributing to this is the exodus of over 1 million people during this period, as the country faces severe economic hardship, lack of electricity, food, and water. Cuban authorities have acknowledged that the natural growth rate is negative, meaning more people are dying than ever being born. From 2021 to 2023, there were around 405,000 deaths, while only 284,000 children were born, further contributing to the population drop. Cuba's birth rate has been steadily declining for years, with the population aging and fewer women of reproductive age remaining on the island. Migration has also played a major role. The United States has been the top destination for Cuban immigrants, with around 425,000 Cubans attempting to enter the country. Mexico, Brazil, and Uruguay are other common destinations. This mass emigration is reshaping Cuba's demographic profile, leaving behind an aging population that puts additional pressure on the already struggling economy. The country's population pyramid reveals a shrinking younger population and an expanding elderly group, which is expected to strain the state's resources even further. With fewer people entering the workforce and contributing to the economy, the government will face increasing difficulties in supporting retirees, particularly as the economic crisis worsens. Cuba is also facing a growth shift towards dollarization as more people prefer to use US dollars instead of the local currency, the peso. This unofficial dollar economy has been growing, particularly on the streets, where many goods and services are now bought and sold in dollars. The Cuban government has resisted this trend because it limits the ability to control the money supply, inflation, and interest rates. However, as the country's economic crisis deepens, the government has been forced to partially embrace dollarization. In 2024, Prime Minister Manuel Marrero announced that the government would begin accepting foreign currency payments in sectors like tourism, hotels, and retail stores. This was seen as a necessary step to stabilize the country's finances as Cuba struggles to buy food, oil, and pay its creditors. This move is a departure from previous policies that required tourists to use prepaid cards in a local virtual currency known as MLC. Many tourists and Cubans have complained about this system, especially in a country with poor infrastructure and frequent blackouts, which often prevent card payments from being processed. While Marrero emphasized the full dollarization is not the government's goal, accepting foreign currency in certain sectors was considered necessary to prevent further financial losses. The government is also introducing stricter regulations on the private sector, including taxes and tighter controls to suppress the informal currency market that has absorbed much of the foreign exchange entering the country. These measures aim to stabilize the economy in the short term, but Cuba continues to face severe challenges, with the peso losing value and the economy struggling to survive. Cuba's private sector has experienced rapid growth over the past few years, but recent government actions are threatening its future. Since 2021, small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, have become key players in importing essential goods like food, filling gaps left by the government. These businesses also offer services in construction, transportation, and even technology, making up about 20% of the country's GDP. In 2023, the private sector imported over $1.3 billion in goods, showcasing its importance to the struggling economy. Despite these contributions, the government has recently taken steps to curb the private sector's growth. Prime Minister Manuel Marrero has criticized these businesses for driving up the price of the dollar and evading taxes, which has deprived the government of important foreign currency. This, Marrero claims, has created an uncontrollable demand for dollars, contributing to the economic instability. As a result, the government has imposed stricter regulations on the private sector, including higher taxes, price caps on food and goods, and restrictions on payments using foreign banks. The crackdown includes the elimination of certain tax incentives for private businesses, audits, and even arrests of some business owners for alleged corruption and tax evasion. The Cuban government also deployed 7,000 inspectors to enforce compliance, issuing thousands of fines in a matter of days. These harsh measures have left many questioning the government's strategy. Critics argue that the private sector has been important in supplying much-needed goods during the ongoing economic crisis. Many fear that these new restrictions will force enterprises out of the market at a time when Cuba desperately needs their support. Cuba has historically maintained a strict zero-tolerance policy on drug use and trafficking, imposing harsh penalties on how those caught with drugs are dealt with. However, as the country's economic situation has worsened, so has its ability to effectively enforce its policy. In a recent address to the National Assembly, Cuban leader Miguel Díaz-Canel acknowledged the country's severe economic hardships, noting that shortages of essential goods and medicines are contributing to growing social unrest. This includes rising crime, addiction, and drug-related offenses. Despite recent attempts to strengthen laws against drug trafficking, Cuba is increasingly being used as a transit point for international drug smuggling. The island's location along key maritime routes makes it vulnerable to drug trafficking, particularly through the Caribbean Sea. In 2023, the Cuban government reported an increase in drug seizures and arrests, including over 1,400 people detained for drug-related crimes, with 2 tons of narcotics confiscated. Most of these drugs were intercepted at sea, a growing concern for law enforcement. Cuban authorities have launched efforts to crack down on drug smuggling through various channels, including airports and cargo shipments. However, the rise in addiction, particularly among younger Cubans, is an alarming trend. The economic crisis caused by social disparities and limited public health infrastructure has made it difficult for the government to control this issue effectively. Law enforcement has intensified efforts to combat the problem, but many argue that a more comprehensive approach, combining enforcement with education and rehabilitation, is needed to address the growing drug problem in the country.